Man, you're funny. You're like Tony. You one of them funny East Coast guys, huh? You here to do stand-up?
No, are you?
Book doesn't need a stage. People laugh at him just walking down the street.
Whatever you say, Nick.
What?
My previous Midnight Club video covering all of the first 3 games in the series was very interesting for myself to say the least. And even if they didn't end up blowing me away, one thing I can say for certain is that there was clearly a trend of each new entry improving exponentially over the previous. If you want to know my thoughts on Street Racing, Midnight Club 2 and 3 from the perspective of someone who had never played those games before, then I highly recommend you go and watch that video first. There is a link at the top of the description, or you can click the title card that's about to pop up at the top of the screen. In this video, however, we're looking at what may or may not be the last Midnight Club game ever made. I have been pretty excited to try out Midnight Club LA. There's no doubt that every single game I have played in this 2-part project had brought some major improvements over the one preceding it in many different areas, even if this franchise didn't exactly hit the ground running from the very start. And seeing that Midnight Club 3 didn't really hit the spot for me in terms of what I like in street racing games, and that it's often debated amongst fans of the series as to which of the last 2 games is the better one, I started to think that maybe I may fall into that latter camp of people who prefer Midnight Club LA over the 3rd game. I guess we'll have to see if this pans out to be true. But first, there are some things you should know before we go any further. I am emulating Midnight Club LA with Xenia Canary, and this comes with a couple minor issues that are present because of this. The first issue is that, even after tinkering with different settings and patches, I could never get the game to run at its intended frame rate. Having looked at a lot of different footage from the game running on an actual Xbox 360, my guess is that I'm slow by something like 5 to 10% frames per second. The game is very much playable like this, and I got used to the frame rate pretty quickly, but I would be lying if I said that I wouldn't have benefited from the game running a little bit faster. I won't be making any more comments about the performance anywhere else in this video, as this is obviously not a fault on the game itself. The game is locked to 30 frames per second on consoles though, which I'm sure I would have had a lot to complain about in that department. The other problem came in the form of audio issues, though only with music and dialogue for some reason. Sometimes I would be driving around and the soundtrack would just switch to my left ear, whereas sometimes it would just cut off completely, which is a shame because the little I did hear of the soundtrack sounded pretty good. Dialogue is similarly busted, with the particularly amusing side effect of sometimes boosting sound effects, such as footsteps in cutscenes, to be much louder than the actual characters talking. Seeing how these games never really had much of a story to speak of, though, this isn't really a problem.
What did it be like last time? When one of your friends refused to give up his car?
Every single game within the Midnight Club franchise up to this point existed mostly on the 6th generation of video game consoles, i.e. the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox. This is, of course, excluding the numerous ports the games received over the years, mainly to the PSP. Los Angeles was the first game made for the next generation, and it definitely looks the part. If, like me, you've never really been exposed to MCLA before, the graphics may nonetheless still look somewhat familiar to you. This was around the time where Rockstar Games began using their proprietary Rage engine, on which they would go on to make all of their open world games from 2006 onwards. And it probably looks familiar to you thanks to the smash hit that was Rockstar Games Presents Table Tennis.
1-1.
Or this little side project of theirs called GTA 4, which released only a few months after LA in December of 2008. This early version of the Rage engine was definitely impressive for the time. One of the first things I noticed was the fact that all of the cutscenes in the game are rendered in-engine, with the only exception being the intro cinematic. This generational jump is also clearly displayed in the detailed world of Los Angeles itself, as it damn right should. because this is the only map we have available to play with this last installment of the Midnight Club franchise. This is quite a drastic change coming from all of the other games I have reviewed up to this point. Having a career mode that spanned across multiple cities, and even countries for that matter, was a fairly big part of the series' identity. And I wouldn't be surprised if this shift to limiting the player to just one location was even at least a little controversial. However, this reduction in playable maps shouldn't be taken at face value. The world of Midnight Club Los Angeles is big. It's often difficult to find exact dimensions when it comes to video game maps, this game included, but I found multiple sources stating that this portrayal of Los Angeles is bigger than the 3 maps in Midnight Club 3 combined. And even though it's not exactly clear to me whether this is referring to the final version of the map found in the complete edition of MCLA or the vanilla game, it's nonetheless an impressive feat, especially when you consider just how detailed Los Angeles actually is here. Whereas there are many aspects of Rockstar's game design that can rightfully be criticized in recent years, it's pretty difficult to deny that their 3D worlds aren't some of the most detailed in the whole industry. Midnight Club LA is a brilliant example of this. This is the first game in the series to include a full day and night cycle, a vast variety of licensed civilian traffic. The developers used scans of real locations in Los Angeles to recreate in their world, including actual landmark buildings and businesses, one of which you start the game at. The streets are full of pedestrians, walking along typical objects you would expect to see lining the pavements, such as benches, bus stops, fire hydrants, and mailboxes, all of which combines into the most lively feeling city the series has ever seen. Granted, this early version of the Rage engine does show its rougher edges here and there, displaying an often shockingly low level of detail on buildings that aren't even that far away from the player. But the jump in quality in the visual department overall is undeniable. As a small side note, something I've noted about the series as a whole is how the way in which the player interacts with pedestrians seems to get worse from one game to another. It was pointed out to me in the comments section of my last Midnight Club video that this was probably due to the fact that this series started putting licensed cars in their games. And that makes complete sense to me. There's a reason for why you won't find any Toyota cars in Need for Speed Heat, and that game doesn't even have pedestrians to speak of. Moreover, on the world design though, something that became very apparent to me was that, in terms of gameplay, I found having just a single large map to be a lot more enjoyable. A big factor that differentiates racing in the Midnight Club series to, say, the Need for Speed games that were being released around the same time, was the fact that the player benefited from learning the map layouts to be able to race more effectively. Where the Need for Speed games had you grinding invisible walls around circuits, the checkpoint-based event system that has been the core of every single Midnight Club game from the very beginning forced you to pay a lot more attention, actively looking for possible shortcuts, for example, or often giving you multiple different paths to get from one point to another. And the game lets you figure all of that out on your own. This was all pretty unique to me, having only just started playing through the series recently. But the issue I ran into was that the Midnight Club games up to this point didn't keep me in any single city for long enough to be able to truly learn their ins and outs. This hasn't been an issue for me in MCLA though. Not only do you spend the entire game in this city, giving you ample time to visit every nook and cranny throughout your racing career, but the higher level of detail of each individual street also makes them much more distinct from each other in my mind, making them a lot easier to recognize and remember. I think this last point is especially important. I really believe that, was I forced to spend 8 hours a day driving around the Midnight Club 2 depiction of the same city, I would still have a much harder time getting around in that game over the much more memorable map of MCLA. So I think it's needless to say this, but I think the map is great. Definitely the best in the series in my opinion, and I'd even put it up there as one of the more fun cities to drive around in any other street racing game I've played throughout the years. And that's all well and good. But a good map doesn't mean much if the core gameplay doesn't stack up. So the question stands. How is the driving in Midnight Club Los Angeles? The first thing you do when you start the game is pick your starting car out of the 3 genders: Japanese, German, or German. My choice was the Golf as it was the funniest option. But it's a choice that would bite me in the ass a little bit. Right off the bat, I could tell that the driving had a lot more weight behind it when comparing it to the rest of the franchise. This is a lot more in line with how I prefer my racing games to feel to control, though I could understand if this was something that drove some fans away who preferred the lightweight control system in Midnight Club 2 and 3. But the steering in this thing felt very off. The only way I can describe it would be that it felt like I had a reverse dead zone on my analog stick. I'd start pushing it to turn very slowly, and the Golf would make the tiniest of turns up to a certain point. After crossing this proverbial dead zone, however, the car would just fully lock into whichever direction I was steering in. It almost felt like playing Midnight Club 2 again with the keyboard, except I had some small ability to gently blow my car left or right if I rubbed its belly and asked very nicely. I eventually gave up with that though, and my gameplay consisted of a lot of out-of-control skidding as I tried to dodge traffic. I'm not going to lie to you and say that this didn't make me a little bit happy on the inside though. What are we, like 4 games into the series now? And Rockstar still couldn't get their shit together with how the game fucking controls. And oh my god, the bike. It's so much better. But then, a few hours later, after I finally gave up on my little idea of trying to see how far I can get through the game in the shitbox Golf and bought a real car, I had to eat my words. Like, a lot of them. The point where I bought this Chevy in my playthrough was also the exact point where I began to experience Midnight Club Los Angeles properly. Up until now, the controls didn't feel that great. I feel that the frame rate played a small part in this, but I was ultimately getting tired of feeling like I didn't have enough fine input over my steering. And wouldn't you know it, that's just how this specific car controls. Having now experimented with many of the different cars available to play in Midnight Club LA, the thing that surprised me the most was just how different they all feel from each other. And it's kind of funny in a way that, had I picked any of the other 2 starting vehicles at the start of the game, my experience would have been a lot more positive from the get-go. Some of the ways in which the cars all differ from each other don't really come as that much of a surprise. Rear-wheel drive cars are predictably more prone to power sliding around corners, whereas front-wheel cars are a little bit less sideways inclined. But it was the little nuances of how each individual vehicle behaved, like the slightly different ways they reacted to inputs, that really surprised me in a positive way. Every car feels like its own unique entity, and I think that's great. I just wish I figured that out a little earlier on in my playthrough. Midnight Club LA has also proven to me that some of the criticisms I make in my videos aren't all entirely bullshit. We see a return of the special abilities that were introduced in the 3rd game in the series. The same ones that didn't quite sit right with me when I talked about them in the previous video. Rockstar must have felt the same way about them, because the way they are implemented in this game are actually very similar to one of my suggestions for improving the mechanic. Which is kind of eerie considering the fact that I hadn't even been exposed to MCLA at that point. That being, you can now apply any ability to any car you want. You can swap them out at any time in the garage as well, which is a lot more forgiving than my suggestion of having to commit to whatever ability you first select. But it's nonetheless a great direction towards giving the player more freedom to tailor the game towards their own specific playstyles. All of the abilities in the game are also now recharged in the same way, by driving cleanly over 50 miles per hour, which benefits more of them than it doesn't. I'm looking at you, Zone. That being said, I'm kind of sad to see that drifting isn't being used to charge any of these abilities up, as that's one mechanic that feels better than ever before in the series to me. Zone, Aggro, and Roar are all back as abilities and are functionally unchanged from their first iteration, though a new 4th ability, the EMP, has now also been added. The name of this new ability is kind of misleading, and in fact so is its description on basically every wiki I could find on the topic. The EMP ability doesn't just disable the electronics of the cars surrounding the player, it disables the entire car from doing pretty much anything. I think Rockstar missed a cool opportunity here. It would have been cool if this ability acted more like the name suggests and disabled the electronics of the car. because that would leave some opponents more vulnerable to the attack over others. It would be interesting if the ability was able to take into consideration whether the cars in its radius had electronic power steering, for instance, or other stability control systems, and affected those weak spots as opposed to just killing the entire car. I think that could have added a lot more depth to the mechanic, but overall I'm quite happy with how the abilities have been implemented into Midnight Club Los Angeles. And since I've already kind of touched on this point, let's talk about the many racers you will be competing against in the world of Los Angeles. But before I start talking about their AI and how different it is compared to all of the games in the series so far, I want to go back to the whole world design point again for just a moment. I've mentioned that the map of Los Angeles is already one of the most authentic cities I've ever experienced in a street racing game. And while a lot of that has to do with the visual detail of the world, I was surprised at how much the characters you find all around Los Angeles also adds to this immersion. Most of the event markers you see on the map have a name tied to them. Names of recurring characters that you will run into many times as you progress through the game. And every time you meet them, you get a short little cutscene of them talking shit with the player character before the race starts. Even if these interactions ultimately just resort to yo mama jokes and references to trust funds and hillbillies, it still manages to put some sort of face to all of the different people you will be interacting with constantly throughout the game. It's something that Midnight Club 2 was somewhat successful with, whereas the third game pretty much abandoned the idea completely, and I'm glad that they finally made it work. Speaking of the third game though, one of the biggest annoyances I experienced in Midnight Club 3 involved the AI. I, of course, covered this in greater detail in my first video on the franchise, but the condensed version is that the rival AI in that game had a lot of advantages over the player that ultimately ended up hurting my overall experience. One of the big complaints I ended up making was that the other racers in the events can push you around without any real consequences, whereas if you try to do the same to them, you can barely even get them to budge. You can imagine then just how fucking cathartic it felt for me to see that this is no longer a problem in MCLA. It really feels great to finally be able to stand on equal footing with the AI after playing through Midnight Club 3. The AI can push me around, but I can hit them right back. It's like the circle of life. Harmony has been restored. And the one other factor that synergizes with this new player to AI balance is the fact that I have yet to witness even a single instance of blatant rubber banding throughout my playtime. And they're definitely not set to any sort of pre-programmed path in races like I suspect them to be in Midnight Club 3, at least to some extent. I think there are many reasons for why these two specific changes combine to be so great. The first being that the AI is allowed to fuck up now. It doesn't happen super often, but there have been a handful of times where I was able to clutch a victory because the car in front of me decided to show off with a barrel roll. It happens just often enough to keep you from restart scumming 10 seconds into a race, because you never know what misfortunes your opponents might be met with just around the next few corners. The lack of rubber banding, or Scale X trick AI, also means that even if you yourself end up in last place because of a nasty collision, or even something as simple as missing a turn, there's a good chance that you'll be able to catch up again. It's a really stark contrast to my racing experience in Midnight Club 3, where I started to develop muscle memory in my thumb to reach for the start button and hit restart the second I hit anything major. If we're judging all of the games by nothing but how fun the actual racing is, then Midnight Club Los Angeles gets the #1 spot for me out of all of the 4 games in the series. And it's a really good thing that I like the driving in MCLA, because this game is packed with a lot of content to keep you busy. Before I even go into all of the new event types that have been added to Midnight Club Los Angeles, I need to talk about how much better initiating races is over any other game in the franchise. I have ranted and raved about how annoying this can get in street racing in Midnight Club 2, and even though this whole side of the gameplay was made a lot less tedious in the third game, MCLA has finally figured it out after all of these years. The core of initiating events remains unchanged. You travel to a point on the map where you will either encounter a rival or an event marker. Driving through the latter will throw you into the event with no further hassle. These are usually reserved for tournaments and other special event types that I will talk about in a minute. For most other event types though, you drive up to one of these rival cars and flash your headlights. Where the massive improvement lies is in the fact that you don't even have to race them to the starting line if you don't want to. You can still do so, of course, and receive a small rep boost if you get there first, which is the game's experience system that unlocks new cars and upgrades as you progress to the career mode. But if you just want to get through a bunch of events without having to get through this part of the game over and over again, which was what I wanted to do, especially during longer play sessions, then you can simply flash your headlights again, after which you will be teleported to the starting line. Rockstar, you fucking did it. However, even with the existence of this feature, I still found myself racing my rivals to the starting line quite often. The aforementioned rep boost is probably part of it, but not only is the direction of the starting line clearly marked with this directional arrow around the minimap, spending more time driving through the map allows you to get to know your way around it a little bit more, which is important as mentioned prior. As for the events themselves, there are a lot of them. So many, in fact, that I wouldn't be surprised if I haven't even experienced all of them after around 20 hours of playtime. And I guess I could do what I've done with every other game in the series so far and go through each event type individually. But the truth of the matter is that I didn't find any of them to be particularly bad in any way. I enjoyed pretty much everything I did in Midnight Club LA, and the only criticisms worth mentioning are merely slight annoyances that don't make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. We have a lot of returning staples of the Midnight Club franchise, such as circuit and sprint races, the single checkpoint sprint that rewards knowledge of the map, time trials, and championships. I want to commit and say that the random order events that I just loved so much in the previous games have been removed, but I was proven wrong when I said that about Midnight Club 3. I'll instead say that I haven't ran into them in the 20 hours I spent in the game, and I'm not exactly crying about it. However, there are a few more examples of event types that technically belong in the categories I've just mentioned, but which change up enough to make them more distinct and interesting. Highway races, for example, are technically sprints that are limited to the map's highway system. They're made a little more interesting though by just how fast they tend to be and by the fact that you only ever race against a single opponent. Nonetheless, this actually ended up being my least favorite out of all of the events in the game for two reasons. The first being that the finish lines usually place you pretty far away from most other events, so there's quite a lot of travel time involved after the fact, unless you just teleport to a garage. The second reason is that they're usually an easy win. The fact that you can initiate this event type on the move, zooming past your opponent as you spam your high beams, makes it incredibly hard for them to be able to catch up. The majority of the challenge at that point comes from dodging traffic, and I was able to win these highway races ranked as very hard, even in the starter golf. The other event derivative I came across came in the form of a special delivery mission from Carol, the garage owner character that you are introduced to early on in the game. And this one I have a lot more better things to say about. At its core, it's just a time trial with a single checkpoint you have to navigate towards. However, the whole mission is based around making car deliveries for Carol to his customers. So not only does each new mission give you a new car to drive, but you also have to make sure that you don't deal enough damage to it before you get to the finish line for the new owner to be like, "What the fuck did you do to my car?" It's a really cool spin on a pretty standard event, and I would have loved to see more like it. The only real criticism I have to make is that some event types, such as multi-checkpoint sprint races, could have benefited from some sort of progress bar that told you how long you have before you finish the race. I imagine a percentage bar similar to the sprint and toll booth races in Most Wanted would have been hard to implement, seeing how you're not bound to a track per se like you would be in the Need for Speed games. But at the very least, it would be nice if the game showed me how many checkpoints I have left. It's nice to know if I screw up and end up in last place if I'll have any chance of winning if I continue, or if I would be better off to just restart. And with that, I've covered pretty much everything I wanted to talk about when it comes to... what the fuck is going on outside? The changes made to the police in MCLA are... interesting. In some aspects, the ways in which they differ from the last game in the franchise make them feel like a massive improvement. But in other ways, they really just feel like an afterthought. Let me start with the good side of things, because there are a lot of ways in which the police in MCLA has its contemporaries, like Most Wanted and Carbon, beat. This is the first street racing game I've played where the cops feel like they actually have somewhat of a presence in the city you inhabit. This is cleverly done through a couple of little mechanics. For instance, where flashing your headlights at an opponent will usually commence a race to the starting line of his event, this sequence will be bypassed if there is a police car nearby, and your opponent will comment on that as you are teleported. Police will also often roam the world as you look for events, and you can avoid being chased by them if you abide by the speed limit as you drive past them. Should you fail that though, the police chases themselves feel pretty good. I especially like the comms they have between each other as they try to keep up with you and update other patrol cars on your location. You can also finally be busted, cutscene and all, with a cash penalty depending on the length of the pursuit and the amount of damage caused to the city. The only gripe I have with them is that, while rubber banding doesn't seem to be much of an issue, teleporting is a whole different problem. Just when you think you've managed to get away, the game will often spawn more police cars in whichever direction you are going, which doesn't really tickle my peach all that much, I must say. But even everything that is done right falls apart when you realize that cops only exist within the parallel universe of free roam. Unless there's some sort of special event type I have yet to encounter, cops will not spawn during races, making this the first game in the series not to feature police chases in events. I have pretty mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I don't doubt that having a chance of a police pursuit initiating an event would have added a decent challenge to the game. Los Angeles has a lot of wide open streets that aren't really as populated with traffic as they were in Midnight Club 2 or 3, meaning that you would have plenty of space to battle it out with the cops during races without running a big risk of jeopardizing your position. From what I could tell, their AI also seems to be a lot more sensible. While the police in this game does tend to utilize pit maneuvers and some other slight tapping here and there, they usually refrain from doing anything too stupid at higher speeds. And in general, it feels to me like they behave in realistic ways, i.e. trying not to die first and foremost, which is a refreshing change from the kamikaze-style AI of the other games. But on the other hand, it is quite nice to just be able to do all of these races and not have to worry about the cops. That's a big reason for why I revisit the Underground games so often. Just hours worth of racing with no additional bullshit. And I kind of enjoy that about MCLA as well. And saying that having police in these events could be nice also assumes that they're implemented well. And I could imagine many ways in which this could have completely been fucked up. And thus, we are finally at the end of this little Midnight Club saga of mine. There sure have been some low points along the way, but it's almost hard to get my head around just how much the series has progressed since its debut in the year 2000. But that leaves me with one more topic to comment on before I finish this video up. Midnight Club Los Angeles is the last game in the series for now, and you may be able to conclude from all of the things I have talked about in this video that this is by far my favorite out of all of the games I have covered. However, with the minor rumors coming out about the development of Midnight Club 5 circulating around the internet over the past year or so, some more credible than others, we'll have to see if MCLA will be able to hold out that spot for me if that game ever comes out. I would, however, be cautious. Even though I have noted this exponential trend of improvement in the series as it progressed, we have to remember that every game I've reviewed for this series of videos came out within just 8 years of each other. It has been 15 years since the original release of Midnight Club Los Angeles, and a lot can change within such a long stretch of time. Nonetheless, I do hope that we get a good 5th installment to the series, because if nothing else, Need for Speed needs some good fucking competition recently. I'm feeling a strong 8 to a light 9 on this one.
I want you to subscribe to me
Scav Merchant Hub
on YouTube. Thank you, cringe. Fuck.